The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business, by Charles Duhigg. Introduction. She was 34 years old, and by almost any measure, her life was falling apart. According to her file, her name was Lisa Allen. She'd been smoking and drinking since she was 16. She had struggled with obesity for most of her life and was drowning in $10,000 of debt. Her longest job had lasted less than a year. But the woman sitting in front of the scientist that day was different. She was lean, vibrant, with the toned legs of a runner. She looked a decade younger than the photos in her chart. She had no debt, hadn't had a drink in years, and was in her third year at a graphic design firm. "How long since your last cigarette?" one of the doctors asked. "Almost 4 years," she said. "And I've lost 60 pounds and run a marathon since then." She'd also started a master's degree. She'd bought a home. For 3 years, these scientists, neurologists, psychologists, geneticists, had been studying Lisa and a few dozen others just like her. People who had, in a relatively short time, completely remade their lives. They wanted to understand how. So they measured their vital signs, installed video cameras in their homes, sequenced their DNA, and peered inside their skulls as their brains reacted to temptation. They asked Lisa to tell her story one more time. How did she do it? How did she give up smoking? "Sure," Lisa said. "It started in Cairo." She explained that a few months earlier, her husband had come home and announced he was in love with someone else. A period of grief turned into a period of obsession, following his new girlfriend around town, making drunken, screaming scenes. It was, she admitted, not a great time for her. So, on an impulse, with her credit cards not yet maxed out, she booked a trip to Egypt. On her first morning in Cairo, she woke at dawn, disoriented and jet-lagged. She reached for a cigarette. But in the dark, she didn't realize, until she smelled burning plastic, that she was trying to light a pen, not a Marlboro. And in that moment, lying in bed, smelling that acrid plastic, something in her broke. A wave of sadness hit her. She felt like everything she had ever wanted had crumbled. She couldn't even smoke right. She felt desperate, like she had to change something, at least one thing she could control. So, sitting in a taxi on the way to the pyramids, she made a crazy decision. She decided she would come back to Egypt one day and trek through the desert. To survive an expedition like that, she told herself, she would have to make sacrifices. In particular, she would have to quit smoking. Now, the scientists in that lab knew that the desert trek itself didn't matter. In fact, when she finally did it 11 months later, it was in an air-conditioned caravan with plenty of water, food, and GPS systems. A carton of cigarettes wouldn't have made a difference. But in that taxi, Lisa didn't know that. That one decision, the conviction that she had to quit smoking to achieve this one goal, had set off a chain reaction. Over the next 6 months, she replaced smoking with jogging. That changed how she ate, how she slept, how she saved money, and how she planned her days. When the researchers examined images of her brain, they saw something remarkable. Her old habits, the neurological patterns of her old self, were still there. But they had been crowded out, overridden by new patterns. As her habits changed, so had her brain. It was one keystone habit that had taught her how to reprogram the rest of her life. What if I told you there's a hidden force shaping almost everything you do, every single day? A force that determines whether you succeed or fail, whether you're happy or miserable, healthy or sick. And what if I told you that by understanding this force, you could rewrite your own story, just like Lisa did? That is the incredible promise of the book we're exploring today, The Power of Habit, by the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Charles Duhigg. This isn't just a book, it's a manual for understanding the hidden architecture of our lives. Duhigg takes us on a journey from the laboratories of MIT to the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies, from the sidelines of the NFL to the front lines of the civil rights movement, all to uncover a simple, profound truth: almost everything we do is governed by habit. And the most powerful part of this discovery? Habits aren't destiny. They can be changed. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the simple three-step loop that runs your life. You'll know the secret ingredient that turns a simple action into an unbreakable craving. And most importantly, you'll hold the key to changing the patterns that define who you are. So, let's begin. Book summary. Imagine your brain is like an onion. The outer layers, the ones closest to your scalp, are the most recent additions in our evolutionary history. They're responsible for complex thought, for laughing at a joke, for inventing something new. But deep inside, near the brainstem, is a much older, more primitive structure. It's a golf ball-sized lump of tissue called the basal ganglia. For years, scientists didn't really understand what it did. They knew it was involved in things like Parkinson's disease, but its full purpose was a mystery. Then, in the 1990s, researchers at MIT started getting curious. They noticed that animals with injuries to this area had trouble learning new tasks, like running through a maze. So they decided to take a closer look. They put tiny sensors into the brains of rats and placed them in a T-shaped maze with a piece of chocolate at one end. At the start, there's a partition that opens with a loud click. The first few times, when the rat hears the click, it wanders around aimlessly. It sniffs the corners, scratches at the walls. It can smell the chocolate, but it doesn't know how to find it. During this time, the probes in its head show its brain is firing on all cylinders. It's analyzing every new sight, sound, and smell. It's working furiously. But then, something remarkable happens. After running the same route day after day, the rat starts to get faster. It stops sniffing corners. It makes fewer wrong turns. It zips straight to the chocolate. And as this happens, its mental activity decreases. As the route becomes automatic, the rat starts thinking less and less. The parts of the brain associated with decision-making and memory go quiet. It's as if the brain is saying, "I've got this. No need to think anymore. Just run." This process, where the brain converts a sequence of actions into an automatic routine, is what scientists call chunking, and it's at the very heart of how habits are formed. The MIT researchers discovered that this entire process is orchestrated by a simple, three-step neurological loop. First, there's a cue. This is the trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. For the rat, the cue was the click of the partition opening. Second, there's the routine. This is the behavior itself, which can be physical, mental, or emotional. For the rat, the routine was running through the maze. And finally, there's the reward. This is what helps your brain figure out if this particular loop is worth remembering for the future. For the rat, the reward was the delicious piece of chocolate. Cue. Routine. Reward. Over time, this loop becomes more and more automatic. Think about backing your car out of the driveway. When you first learned to drive, it required an incredible amount of concentration. You had to think about every single step: opening the garage, adjusting the mirrors, checking for obstacles, putting your foot on the brake, shifting into reverse. Now, you do it without a second thought, maybe while simultaneously sipping coffee and planning your day. That's because as soon as you grab your car keys, the cue, your basal ganglia kicks in, and the whole routine unfolds automatically. The reward? You're safely on your way to work. Habits, Duhigg explains, emerge because our brain is constantly looking for ways to save effort. An efficient brain allows us to stop thinking about basic behaviors so we can devote our mental energy to more important things, like inventing irrigation systems or Video games. But this elegant system has a downside. The brain can't tell the difference between good habits and bad ones. Once a habit is encoded, it never really disappears. It's always lurking in our brain, waiting for the right cue to trigger the routine. This is why it's so hard to quit smoking, stop snacking, or start exercising. The old patterns are always there. To truly understand how deep these patterns run, even when our conscious mind is gone, Duhigg introduces us to one of the most fascinating characters in medical history, a man known as Eugene Pauly, or EP. In 1992, a virus ravaged Eugene's brain, completely destroying the part responsible for short-term memory, the medial temporal lobe. From that day forward, he couldn't form any new memories. He couldn't remember what he had for breakfast, or the names of his doctors, or even that he had a memory problem at all. If you left the room and came back a minute later, it was as if he was meeting you for the first time. And yet, Eugene could still form new habits. His wife, Beverly, noticed something strange. Every morning and afternoon, she would take Eugene for a walk around the block, always along the same route. One day, Eugene slipped out of the house by himself. Beverly was frantic. He'd never be able to find his way home. But 15 minutes later, she found him sitting in the living room, watching TV, with a pocket full of pine cones from a neighbor's yard. He had gone for his walk and found his way back, even though he couldn't have drawn a map of his own house. A scientist named Larry Squire decided to test this. He gave Eugene a task: choose between pairs of colored objects. Under one object in each pair, there was a sticker that said correct. Eugene had no memory of doing the test from one day to the next. But after weeks of training, he started picking the correct object almost every time. "How am I doing this?" he asked the researcher, bewildered. "It's here somehow or another," he said, pointing to his head. "And the hand goes for it." Eugene's brain had built a habit loop. The pair of objects was the cue. Choosing one was the routine. The satisfaction of finding the correct sticker was the reward. His conscious mind was gone, but his habit-forming brain was still perfectly functional. Eugene's story is a powerful, almost haunting, demonstration that habits can operate completely outside our awareness. They are a fundamental force of our neurology. We might not remember the experiences that create them, but once they are lodged in our brains, they influence how we act, often without our realization. This brings us to a critical question. If the habit loop is so powerful and automatic, how can we ever hope to create a new one? How do you build a good habit from scratch? For that, we turn to one of the greatest advertising legends of the 20th century, a man named Claude C. Hopkins. In the early 1900s, Hopkins was approached with a business idea: a new, minty toothpaste called Pepsodent. At the time, selling toothpaste was considered financial suicide. Despite a national crisis of rotting teeth, hardly anyone in America brushed. The habits simply didn't exist. Hopkins knew he couldn't just tell people to brush. He needed to tap into the habit loop. He needed a cue and a reward. So he sat down with a pile of dental textbooks and found a reference to the mucin plaques on teeth, which he later called the film. This was his genius. Tooth film is a naturally occurring membrane. It's always been there. You can get rid of it by eating an apple or just running your tongue over your teeth. But Hopkins decided to turn this universal, impossible to ignore sensation into a cue. His ads were plastered everywhere. "Just run your tongue across your teeth," one read. "You'll feel a film? That's what makes your teeth look off color and invites decay." Suddenly, millions of people were running their tongues over their teeth, feeling a film they'd never noticed before. Hopkins had found a simple, obvious cue. And the reward? Pepsodent removes the film, another ad proclaimed, next to pictures of smiling beauties. The reward was a prettier smile, a sense of beauty and attractiveness. Within a decade, toothbrushing went from an obscure practice to a daily ritual for more than half the American population. Pepsodent was one of the best-known products on Earth. Hopkins had, seemingly, cracked the code. Find a simple cue. Clearly define the reward. But it turns out, there's a third, hidden ingredient. An element so powerful that Hopkins himself used it without even knowing it. An element that explains why some habits take hold and others don't. That ingredient is craving. To understand craving, we have to go back to the lab, this time with a neuroscientist named Wolfram Schultz and a monkey named Julio. Schultz put a very thin electrode into Julio's brain to monitor his neural activity. Julio's job was simple. When colored shapes appeared on a screen, the cue, he had to touch a lever, the routine. If he did it right, a drop of blackberry juice would run down a tube and onto his lips, the reward. Julio loved blackberry juice. At first, when Julio got the juice, Schultz saw a spike in his brain activity. It was a pattern that essentially said, "I got a reward." But as the experiment continued and the behavior became a habit, something shifted. The "I got a reward" spike started appearing before the juice arrived. It happened the instant Julio saw the shapes on the screen. His brain had started to anticipate the reward. This anticipation, this expectation of pleasure, is the neurological root of craving. Then Schultz changed the experiment. Sometimes, the juice didn't arrive, or it was delayed. When this happened, Julio would get angry or mopey. And inside his brain, a new pattern erupted, a pattern of desire and frustration. When Julio anticipated the juice but didn't get it, that anticipation turned into a craving that drove his behavior. This is what makes the habit loop spin. The cue doesn't just trigger a routine, it triggers a craving for the reward to come. When a smoker sees a pack of cigarettes, her brain starts anticipating the nicotine hit. That craving is what makes her reach for a cigarette, unthinkingly. When your phone buzzes with a new message, your brain anticipates the momentary distraction. That craving is what makes you check it, even in the middle of a meeting. Cravings are what drive habits. Now, let's go back to Claude Hopkins and Pepsodent. It turns out, dozens of other toothpaste companies had used the same Q-tooth film and the same reward, beautiful teeth. None of them worked. So why did Pepsodent succeed? Because, unbeknownst to Hopkins, Pepsodent contained ingredients like citric acid and mint oil. These were irritants that created a cool, tingling sensation on the tongue and gums. Customers started to associate that tingle with cleanliness. They began to crave that sensation. If they forgot to use Pepsodent, they missed the tingle. Their mouth just didn't feel clean. Hopkins wasn't selling beautiful teeth. He was selling a sensation. He had accidentally stumbled upon the power of craving. This same principle was later discovered, the hard way, by the marketing team at Procter & Gamble when they launched a revolutionary new product in 1996. The product was a spray that could remove bad smells from almost any fabric. They called it Febreze. Pandag had spent millions developing it. They knew from market research that consumers were desperate for something that could eradicate odors, not just mask them. Their first ad campaign was built on a simple habit loop. The cue was a bad smell, like cigarettes or pets. The routine was spraying Febreze. The reward was getting rid of the odor. It was a complete and utter flop. The team was in a panic. Their careers were on the line. What had they done wrong? They went back into people's homes to find out. They visited one woman who had 9 cats. The smell in her house was so overpowering that one of the researchers gagged. "What do you do about the cat smell?" a scientist asked her. "It's usually not a problem," she said. "How often do you notice it?" "Oh, About once a month. That was the moment of revelation. The people who needed Febreze the most, the smokers, the pet owners, were nose blind to the smells in their own lives. The cue was invisible to them. The team was about to give up when they visited another woman's home. It was clean, tidy. She loved Febreze. "I use it every day," she told them. "But what smells are you trying to get rid of?" they asked. The house didn't seem to have any bad odors. "Oh, I don't really use it for bad smells," she said. "I use it as a final touch after I'm done cleaning. A couple of sprays when I'm done in a room. It's a nice way to make everything smell good." The researchers realized they had been looking at it all wrong. No one craves scentlessness. But lots of people crave a nice smell after they've spent 30 minutes cleaning. It's the reward, the little celebration that says I'm done. So P&G reformulated Febreze, adding more perfume. They changed the ads. Instead of showing people getting rid of bad smells, the commercials showed women spraying freshly made beds and just laundered clothing, with a look of satisfaction. The new cue was finishing a cleaning task. The routine was spraying Febreze. And the reward was that light, clean scent that signals a job well done. They had created a craving. Sales doubled in 2 months. Today, Febreze and its spin-offs are a billion-a-year business. So we have the full formula for creating a new habit: cue, routine, reward, all powered by a craving for the reward to come. But what about changing an old habit, a bad one? For that, we need what Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change. To understand it, we head to the sidelines of the National Football League, with a coach named Tony Dungy. In 1996, Dungy took over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of the worst teams in the history of professional sports. They were a laughingstock. Dungy came in with a radical philosophy. He believed the key to winning wasn't about having more plays or more complicated strategies. It was about changing players' habits. He told them, champions don't do extraordinary things. They do ordinary things, but they do them without thinking, too fast for the other team to react. But Dungy knew he couldn't just create new habits from scratch. These were professional athletes who had spent their entire lives building the habits that got them to the NFL. So instead, he focused on changing their old ones. And his strategy embodied the golden rule. You can't extinguish a bad habit. You can only change it. The rule is this: to change a habit, you must keep the old cue, deliver the old reward, but insert a new routine. Dungy didn't try to teach his players hundreds of new formations. He taught them a handful of simple ones. He used the same cues they were already accustomed to: the formation of the opposing team, the stance of a lineman. He offered them the same reward they all craved: victory. But he changed the routine. Instead of having them analyze a dozen different things on the field, he trained them to react automatically to just one or two keys. He drilled these new, simpler routines over and over, until they were faster and more automatic than their old, complicated habits. It took time. The team struggled at first. But slowly, the new habits took hold. The Bucs started winning. They went to the playoffs for the first time in 15 years. Dungy's system worked. The golden rule is the foundation for almost every successful behavior change program. Take Alcoholics Anonymous. AA is essentially a giant machine for changing the habit loops of alcoholism. It works because it forces people to identify the cues and rewards that drive their drinking. The cue might be stress, anxiety, or loneliness. The reward might be escape, relaxation, or companionship. AA keeps the cue and the reward. It just inserts a new routine. When you feel that cue of stress, instead of having a drink, your new routine is to call your sponsor or go to a meeting. You still get the reward of relief and companionship. Same cue, same reward, new routine. Duhigg shows us this in action with a woman named Mandy, a chronic nail-biter. Her habit was so bad her fingertips were covered in scabs. A therapist helped her identify her habit loop. The cue was a feeling of tension in her fingers. The routine was biting her nails. The reward was a brief sense of physical stimulation that she craved. To change the habit, the therapist gave her a competing response. Whenever she felt the cue, the tension in her fingers, she was to immediately put her hands in her pockets or grip a pencil, making it impossible to bite. Then, she was to rub her arm or rap her knuckles on a desk, anything that would provide a similar physical stimulation. Same cue, tension. Same reward, physical stimulation. New routine, clench fists, rub arm. Within a month, the nail-biting habit was gone. But as Tony Dungy discovered, sometimes even the golden rule isn't enough. His Buccaneers, despite their improvement, would often choke in high-pressure games. Under stress, they would revert to their old habits. Something was missing. That missing ingredient is belief. For a habit to stay changed, people must believe that change is possible. And most often, that belief only emerges with the help of a group. In AA, this is crucial. It's not just about the new routine. It's about being in a room full of people and thinking, if it worked for that guy, maybe it can work for me. The community creates and sustains the belief that you can change. This is what finally happened for Tony Dungy. After years of success, he was fired from the Buccaneers. He moved to the Indianapolis Colts and implemented the same system. They became a winning team, but again, they faltered in the playoffs. Then, tragedy struck. Dungy's oldest son, Jamie, died by suicide. The team watched their coach go through this terrible loss with grace and quiet strength. In the aftermath, something shifted. The players rallied around him. A new sense of community, a new depth of trust, was forged. They didn't just follow his system anymore. They truly believed in it, and in each other. The next season, they went to the Super Bowl. In the conference championship game, they were down 21-3 at halftime. No team had ever come back from a deficit that large. But in the locker room, Dungy told them to believe. They went out in the second half, trusted their habits, and won the game. 2 weeks later, they won the Super Bowl. Belief is the ingredient that makes a reworked habit loop into a permanent behavior. Now, some habits are more powerful than others. Duhigg introduces us to the concept of keystone habits. These are habits that, when they change, start a chain reaction, dislodging and remaking other patterns. The story of Paul O'Neill at Alcoa is the perfect example. In 1987, O'Neill became the CEO of the aluminum giant. The company was in trouble. On his first day, he gave a speech to Wall Street investors. They expected to hear about profits and cost-cutting. Instead, O'Neill said, "I want to talk to you about worker safety." He announced his goal was to make Alcoa the safest company in America, to go for 0 injuries. The investors were horrified. They thought he was a crazy hippie. One of them ran out and sold all his stock, calling it the worst piece of advice he ever gave in his career. But O'Neill knew what he was doing. Worker safety was his keystone habit. He created a new habit loop. The cue was an employee injury. The routine was that the unit president had to report it to O'Neill himself within 24 hours and present a plan for making sure it never happened again. The reward? The only people who got promoted were the ones who embraced the system. To make this work, the entire company had to change. A unit president couldn't report to the CEO in 24 hours unless he heard from his vice presidents immediately. Vice presidents needed to be in constant communication with floor managers. Floor managers needed workers to speak up as soon as they saw a problem. The rigid, bureaucratic hierarchy of Alcoa crumbled. New communication systems were built. The culture transformed. And as the company's habits around safety shifted, everything else improved. When they redesigned a process to prevent injuries from splashing molten metal, they also saved money by spilling less raw material. When they replaced a machine that was causing injuries, they also improved product quality, because malfunctioning equipment was a chief cause of defects. Within a year, Alcoa's profits hit a record high. By the time O'Neill retired, the company's income was 5 times larger, and its market capitalization had risen by $27 billion. All because he focused on one keystone habit. Duhigg points out that keystone habits exist in our personal lives too. Studies show that people who start exercising, even just once a week, often start eating better, become more productive at work, smoke less, and feel less stressed. Exercise is a keystone habit. Making your bed every morning is correlated with better productivity and stronger budgeting skills. Family dinners are linked to children with better grades and more emotional control. These small wins create a sense of victory that spills over, convincing us that other, bigger achievements are within reach. This brings us to one of the most important keystone habits of all: willpower. Dozens of studies show that willpower is the single most important keystone habit for individual success. Duhigg illustrates this with a famous Stanford marshmallow experiment. 4-year-olds were offered a deal: 1 marshmallow now, or 2 if they could wait 15 minutes. Years later, the kids who had the willpower to wait had higher SAT scores, better grades, and were more popular. But what is willpower? Is it just a skill? Research says no. Willpower is like a muscle. It gets tired from overuse. If you spend all morning resisting the temptation to check social media, you'll have less willpower to go for a run after work. But also like a muscle, willpower can be strengthened with exercise. This is the principle that Starbucks uses to transform its employees. For many, like Travis Leach, the high school dropout son of drug addicts we met, Starbucks is their first real job. They often lack the self-discipline to handle the stress of customer service. So Starbucks doesn't just hope for the best. It trains willpower. It gives employees routines for their most difficult moments, what Duhigg calls inflection points. When a customer is screaming at you, your willpower muscle is at its weakest. So Starbucks has a pre-programmed routine called the latte method. The cue is the angry customer. The routine is: listen to the customer, acknowledge their complaint, take action by solving the problem, thank them, and explain why the problem occurred. By practicing this routine over and over, it becomes automatic. Employees don't have to make a decision in a stressful moment, they just follow the habit. They are given a plan for how to act when their willpower fails. This is how willpower becomes a habit, by choosing a behavior ahead of time, and then following that routine when an inflection point arrives. Finally, Duhigg takes us from the habits of individuals and companies to the habits of entire societies. How do movements happen? He examines the Montgomery bus boycott. The movement didn't start just because Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Many others had been arrested before her. It started because of a 3-part process of social habits. First, it began with the strong ties of friendship. Rosa Parks was deeply respected and connected across many different social groups in Montgomery. She had what sociologists call strong ties with dozens of circles that didn't usually interact. When she was arrested, her friends immediately mobilized. The natural habit of friendship, to help someone you care about, kicked in. Second, the movement grew because of the weak ties of community and peer pressure. As word of the one-day boycott spread through churches and community organizations, people who didn't even know Rosa Parks felt a sense of obligation to participate. Their friends of friends were joining in. It was a community effort. To be seen riding the bus that Monday would have been a social embarrassment. These weak ties are what transform a protest from a small group of friends into a citywide action. But even that wasn't enough to sustain a movement for over a year. That required the third step. The movement's leaders gave participants new habits that created a fresh sense of identity. Martin Luther King Jr. taught the protesters the habits of nonviolence. This was more than just a tactic. It was a new way of being. When faced with violence and hatred, their new routine was not to fight back, but to love their enemies, to meet hate with forgiveness. This gave them a new identity. They weren't just angry citizens anymore. They were participants in a great historical and moral struggle. They were part of God's plan. This new identity, these new habits, made the movement self-propelling. People took ownership. They became leaders themselves. A movement starts with the habits of friendship. It grows through the habits of community. And it endures when its leaders give people new habits that create a new sense of who they are. From the quiet workings of a single brain to the massive shifts that change societies, Duhigg shows us that habits are the water we swim in. Most of the time, we don't even notice them. But once we understand how they work, once we see the cue, the routine, and the reward, we gain the power to change them. And that brings us to the final, and perhaps most important question of all. If our habits are so powerful, so automatic, how much of our lives are we actually responsible for? Are we responsible for our habits? For this, Duhigg tells the story of Angie Bachman, a homemaker who, out of boredom, started visiting a casino. It began as a fun diversion, with strict rules. But over time, the habit took root. The cues, loneliness, anxiety, the death of her parents, triggered the routine of gambling, which provided the reward of escape and a feeling of control. Her brain, like the problem gamblers in scientific studies, started to see near misses as wins, creating a powerful craving loop that kept her playing. Eventually, she lost her entire inheritance, nearly $1 million. The casino, Harrah's, had known she was a problem gambler. They had her data. They knew she had declared bankruptcy before. But they continued to entice her with free flights, luxury suites, and lines of credit. When she couldn't pay her debts, they sued her. Her lawyer argued that she wasn't responsible. She was acting out of a habit so powerful it had overridden her ability to choose. Around the same time, in Wales, a man named Brian Thomas strangled his wife to death in his sleep. He had a lifelong history of sleep terrors. That night, he dreamt an intruder was attacking his wife, and his most primal habit, the fight or flight response, kicked in. When he woke up, he was holding his wife's body, horrified. The court set him free. He had acted unconsciously, out of a habit he didn't even know could be violent. He was not responsible. So why was Brian Thomas, a murderer, set free, while Angie Bachman, a gambler, was held responsible for her debts? Duhigg suggests the answer lies in awareness. Thomas was not aware of the violent potential of his sleep habit. But Bachman, at some point, became aware of her gambling habit. She knew it was a problem. She tried to stop. She moved to a state where gambling wasn't legal. And this, Duhigg concludes, is the crux of it all. Once you understand that a habit exists, you have the responsibility to change it. A sleepwalking murderer might plausibly argue he was unaware. But for almost all the other patterns in our lives, how we eat, how we spend, how we treat others, we know they exist. And once you know, you have a choice. The power of habit is not that it's a destiny we can't escape. The real power of habit is the insight that your habits are what you choose them to be. Once you understand the loop, you have the freedom and the responsibility to remake it. Commentary. As we come to the end of our journey through the power of habit, I find myself thinking about that simple, powerful idea. The idea that so much of who we are is the sum of our daily, often unconscious, routines. It's both a humbling and an incredibly empowering thought. Humbling, because it means that many of the things we struggle with, the goals we fail to reach, aren't necessarily because of a lack of talent or ambition, but because of the silent, invisible scripts running in the background of our lives. We're all a bit like Eugene Pauly, the man with no memory, following cues in our environment without even knowing why. But it's also incredibly empowering. Because what Charles Duhigg gives us is not a diagnosis without a cure. He gives us a framework. He hands us a wrench and shows us the gears. He tells us that these scripts are not written in stone. They can be edited, rewritten, and replaced. For anyone listening to this, especially if you're young and at the start of building the life you want, this is one of the most important lessons you can ever learn. The habits you build today, the way you study, the way you manage your time, the way you treat people, the way you think about yourself, will form the bedrock of your future. You are, right now, in the process of programming the automatic behaviors that will carry you through life. The most profound lesson for me in this book is the golden rule of habit change. The idea that you don't fight a bad habit, you replace it. This is a shift in perspective that changes everything. It reframes the struggle from a battle of brute force willpower, which we now know is a finite muscle that gets tired, to a more intelligent process of diagnosis and redesign. It's not about saying no 1,000 times. It's about building a better yes. So, what can you do with this today, right now? First, pick one habit. Just one. It doesn't have to be your biggest, most life-altering habit. It could be something small, like checking your phone the moment you wake up, or snacking when you're bored while studying. Second, for the next week, just be a scientist. Don't try to change anything. Just observe. When the urge for that habit hits, take out a piece of paper and write down the answers to Duhigg's 5 questions. Where are you? What time is it? What's your emotional state? Who else is around? What action immediately preceded the urge? This is how you'll find your cue. Third, experiment with the reward. When the urge hits, instead of doing your usual routine, try something else. If you usually grab a snack, try walking around for 5 minutes instead. Or listen to one song. Or text a friend. The goal is to figure out what craving your old routine was actually satisfying. Was it hunger? Or was it boredom? Was it a need for distraction? Or a need for social connection? Once you know the cue and the craving, you can design a new, better routine. This book is a reminder that we are the authors of our own lives. And the language we write in is the language of habit. By learning that language, we can move from being passive characters in a story someone else has written for us, to being the active, conscious creators of the life we want to live. That is the true power of habit. That was a summary of The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. We've certainly hit the big ideas today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The map is useful. It shows you where to go, but it can never replace the experience of actually walking the trails, breathing the air, and seeing the sights for yourself. The real magic of this book happens when you read it. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase hits you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is here to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has struck a chord with you, I truly hope you'll grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning information, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see yourself and the world around you. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.